the two great figures before Plato were Homer and Hesiod. As I have written on the board, you can see. And Homer and Hesiod considered poetry as inspiration. Homer believed that the purpose of poetry was simply to give pleasure. And Hesiod believed that poetry can also give instruction. And therefore, poetry can serve two purposes: pleasing the reader and instructing the reader. When Plato came, he took up a different opinion of poetry. He has referred to poetry in many of his works, as I have written down over there. So first I shall take up the laws. Well, even in the laws, Plato takes up the issue of the ideal state. What should be the form of the ideal state? And how should education be given to the youngsters in an ideal state? And there he says that citizens of the ideal state should be given education in general arts, in good art. And good art is imitation. So once again, students or youths should be educated in general arts, and good art is imitation. In fact, all art is imitation. So we see that the word imitation or mimesis is first taken up by Plato in the laws. And then Plato, when he takes up this same issue in Protagoras, he says that since both Homer and Hesiod had their points about poetry, and they recommended poetry as part of education. Since then, since the time of Plato, poets were taken as educators. Since the time of Homer, poets were taken as educators. So once again, I repeat that the two originally great figures in Greece in the field of art and education were Homer and Hesiod. Homer said poetry should give pleasure. Hesiod said that poetry should give instruction also. So since Homer, poets were taken as educators. And in Lysis, Plato, through the character of Socrates, makes it clear that unrestrained admiration for poets is a mere superstition. Unrestrained admiration for poets is a mere superstition. So from the time of Homer, it was believed that poets were educators, but Plato says that people should not have unrestrained admiration for poets. In Apology, Plato takes up the issue of inspiration, and therefore he suggests that if poetry is a product of inspiration, it will be simply irrational, because at the time of inspiration human rationality does not work. Finally, in Phaedrus and in Ion, please note, in Phaedrus and in Ion, Plato compares poets with madmen, because the poets are sieged with a frenzy, and in that frenzy they write poems, they write their poetry, they compose. So behind the composition of the poets there is a kind of a frenzy. Thus we can see that, well, first in Laws he takes up the issue of poetry and poets and says that, well, the citizens should be educated in good arts, because every good art is imitation, and every good art is imitation. In Protagoras he is against poets, and he says that since Homer, poets are held in great respect as educators, but poets must be taken with a grain of salt. The respect or estimation or admiration for the poets should not be too much, otherwise it will be a rather superstition. In Apology, Plato says that poets compose under the influence of inspiration, and inspiration cannot be rational, therefore poetry is irrational. In Phaedrus and Ion he compares poets with madmen, and he says that poets are sieged with a kind of a frenzy, and in that influence of frenzy they compose. Therefore logic, reason and rationality may not be found in poetry. Now we come to the Republic. In the Republic, Plato discusses poetry primarily in chapters 3 and 10. Now what does he say in chapter 3? Please note, he says that he takes up the issue of poetry in connection with education, and he begins with literary education in three parts: theological, moral and formal. Plato there argues that God is perfect, and therefore God is both changeless and incapable of deceit. But in poetry, poets often show gods with defects, with moral lapses. Poets even project heroes as defective, immoral and often deceitful. Therefore, Plato concludes that the existing poetry was not suitable for the young people of Athens, or rather existing poetry was not suitable for education of the young minds, because existing poetry shows weaknesses moral lapses of the heroes and of gods. And he talks about the form of poetry. He says, poetry is mimesis. Poetry is imitation. And every imitation is defective. Every imitation is full of lacunas, full of defects. Now, why? Because no imitation, according to Plato, no imitation can reproduce the original. So, the original and the reproduced version will be quite different. Therefore, in a sense, poets propound lies. And then in chapter 10, he takes up poetry in more detail. And there he says, poets and poetry, or rather poetry and art, are illusion. Imitation means copying. Copying the reality of the objects and circumstances of the actual world. Plato here introduces the theory of idea, and he speaks of the ideal world and the ideal object. The ideal object, which is perfect, which is devoid of any defect, which is bereft of any lacuna, can exist only in the ideal world. Ideal object can exist only in the ideal world. The ideal action and ideal state has an ideal existence, but all these lie beyond this sensory world, the world of the objects. This world is in fact a copy of the ideal world, and poetry is a copy of this world, and therefore poetry is a double lie. And according to Plato, therefore, the appeal of poetry is low, irrational, and it strengthens the lower elements of the mind at the expense of reason. According to Plato, reason should be the ideal tool of the human being to understand and to decide. But poetry and poets have an adverse impact on the reason in the human mind, and therefore poetry should be discarded. Now I shall be briefly referring to the text. The text that I have is the Penguin Classics. You can see the Republic, and I shall very briefly refer to the text. Well, as you perhaps you know, well, if you do not know, well, I'll tell you that, well, this the Republic, as the other works of Plato, are all represented in dialogue form. And in the Republic too, there are certain characters. These characters they discuss, and the discussion is made in the house of Cephalus, Cephalus, I'll be writing down, Cephalus, who is an wealthy aristocrat, and there are people who are engaged in discussion. They are Glaucon and Adimantus. Glaucon and Adimantus are brothers of Plato, and then there is Thrasymachus, who is an excitable sophist, and of course Socrates, who is the coordinator. Socrates, in fact, is the mouthpiece of Plato. Plato expresses his opinions through Socrates. So, in all, we have five characters, including Cephalus. These five characters who discuss, and the coordinator is Socrates. So, I shall be reading, briefly. We have seen that there are three sorts of beds. The first exists in nature, as you would say. I suppose that was made by God. No one else could have made it, could they? I think not. The second is made by carpenter. Yes. And the third is made by painter. So three kinds of beds. One is made by God, and the other two are made by men. The carpenter represents almost an exact copy of the original bed. But no, it can't be the exact copy. It is, after all, an imitation. And what does the painter do? The painter imitates the carpenter's bed, and therefore the painter's representation will be most defective. Poetry is like that. This world is an imitation of the ideal world. The nature, the flowers, the trees, the birds, the rivers, the seas that we see over here are all imitation of the ideal objects that exist in the ideal world. And what do the poets do? The poets simply imitate objects of the world, of the sensory world, and they represent them in their poetry. So, poetry is doubly removed from truth. This is Plato's idea. Now, Plato's arguments have self-contradictions also. Because, at one point Plato says that inspiration is great, and then he says inspiration is, a sort of frenzy. Under the influence of inspiration, human beings cannot use their rationality. So, of course, there are contradictions in the arguments of Plato. But before that, we should try to understand why Plato exactly wanted to banish poetry. Was it because of an aesthetic reason, or was it because of a political and a social reason? What was the political condition of Athens at the time of Plato? How was he affected by the Peloponnesian War? All these we shall discuss briefly. I'll briefly point out certain things which are important. One is, whereas I have written, Plato was born in 427 BC. That was 4 years after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. The impact of the Peloponnesian War on Athens was tremendous. So Plato spent his childhood watching the ravages that the Spartans were making on Athens during the Peloponnesian War. And after the Peloponnesian War, Athens was simply reduced to fragments. The economy was destroyed, the society was infected, and the youths had no heroes to follow. We shall have to point out another thing which I have written, that Plato's father died and Plato's mother married a second time, and the stepfather of Plato was a close friend of Pericles, the great man of Athens. And therefore, we can imagine that Plato and his family were close to the administration, and Plato could see and understand the political changes that had been happening. After the Peloponnesian War, the primary task was to rebuild Athens. And perhaps The Republic is a book aimed at that direction. How to build up an ideal republic. What should be there in an ideal republic, and what should not be there in an ideal republic. So these are perhaps some of the issues that were in the priority list for Plato when he took up the composition of the republic. And Plato was suggesting that there should be a philosopher king, a king who would have a vision, a mission, and a capability to rebuild Athens. And the young people, the young men of Athens, who were the future citizens of the country, had to be educated in a proper way. And Plato was much concerned about the education of the youngsters. And therefore perhaps he felt that, well, that was a time when emotion, impulse, and frenzy were to be discarded. And it was perhaps the reason that Plato attacked poetry and poets. Sir Philip Sidney, in his Apology for Poetry, says that Plato did not attack poetry, he attacked bad poetry. Sir Philip Sidney wanted to defend Plato. But well, that is not the truth. Plato attacked poetry and poets, and he had a reason, a valid reason for that, political reason. In fact, well, however great a man is, well, one cannot avoid and defy the conditions of the time. And therefore, Plato presented himself as an antagonist towards poets. Now, two or three things more I want to point out before I end this lecture. Now, about poets and lies I have told you. Now, Plato attacks poets on three grounds. One, intellectual; number two, emotional; and number three, social grounds. Now, Plato believed that, well, reading of poetry or writing of poetry would be detrimental, would be harmful for the intellect of the youngsters. And, well, if they become too much emotional, that will kill their power of reasoning. Their rationality will be lost. And the society needed work, only work, dedicated work on the part of the citizens. Therefore, poetry had to be discarded, at least for the time being. And so Plato here, we can say, talks of poetry from a purely utilitarian point of view. And he concludes that poets should not be accommodated in the ideal republic. Well, regarding the criticism of Plato, we can say a few things. It should be noted that Plato, as I pointed out earlier, in his arguments, has a number of contradictions. Now, as I pointed out this earlier also, but once again I repeat that at one point Plato seems to be hostile to inspiration, but at another place he defends inspiration. So, this is perhaps the greatest contradiction that we find in Plato and his argument. And I shall be ending with reference to one very modern scholar. The modern scholar is Karl Popper, Karl Popper, Popper. Karl Popper. Now, Karl Popper speaks of open society and closed society. Open society means a society which can accommodate even the contradictory opinions. And a closed society is one which will be rather totalitarian, accommodating no contrary opinion. And Popper says that Plato perhaps believed in closed society. Plato's state is a state which will have a closed society, and members of the society will have no existence without the society. So, Plato's society, we can say, is a totalitarian society where people were bound together by feelings of intense loyalty towards the state. Therefore, Plato was against poets and poetry, because poets are always liberal, and the poets do not believe in totalitarian societies. Therefore, finally I conclude with a statement that we should read Plato's opinion or Plato's views on poetry, keeping in mind the social and political condition of Plato's time. Aristotle later on came, and Aristotle defied the arguments of Plato, but that happened later. Thank you very much for today.